My radio is my lifeline in the Alaskan wild, the thin wire between life and a frozen grave. But lately it's become something else, a source of dread. It broadcasts pleas for help from places that don't exist on any map. Last night, the desperate voice whispering through the static knew my name. It knew the one secret I buried out here. My job is to answer every call for help. But this one isn't asking for help, it's hunting. Silence is the first thing you lose your mind to out here. It's not an absence of sound, not really. It's a physical entity, a crushing weight that presses in from all sides. Sitka Point, Alaska, is the capital of this particular brand of silence. It's a tiny, forgotten town, clinging to the edge of a continent, a place where the roads just end. I came here 6 months ago, a self-imposed exile. The official story, the one I told my concerned but distant family, was that I needed a change of pace, a break from the relentless chaos of a city paramedic's life. The truth was far simpler and more pathetic. I was running from the ghost of my wife Anna, whose memory haunted every street corner, every familiar cafe, every echo in our empty apartment. I figured, with a grim sort of logic, that no ghost, no matter how persistent, would follow me to the edge of the world. Here my life was meant to be stripped down to its bare essentials: breathe, work, eat, sleep. A monastic existence to cauterize a wound that refused to heal. The heart of my new world was Ambulance Unit 73, a rattling metal box on wheels that smelled perpetually of antiseptic, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. My partner, George, was a man carved from the Alaskan landscape itself. His face was a latticework of deep-set wrinkles from squinting into the glare of sun on snow, his hands thick and calloused from a lifetime of hard work. He spoke in a low rumble, using words sparingly, as if they were a finite resource to be conserved. He was a constant, steady presence, and in the beginning his quiet companionship was a comfort. We developed a shorthand of nods, grunts, and shared looks that could convey entire conversations, a language born of mutual understanding in the face of the vast, indifferent wilderness. Our days were a hypnotic loop of driving through landscapes that were beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Endless forests of snow-laden spruce and pine stood like a silent frozen army, their ranks occasionally breaking to reveal vistas of jagged, ice-choked mountains that clawed at the bruised purple sky. The calls were, for the most part, mundane. We were the only medical response unit for a 100-mile radius, a fact that sat like a stone in my gut during the longer drives. A logger with a chainsaw kickback injury, an elderly woman from the local Tlingit community with pneumonia, a tourist who'd slipped on the ice outside the town's only bar and broken a hip. They were textbook cases, problems with clear solutions. I could put a person back together, stop a bleed, manage a failing airway. These were things I understood. They were physical, logical. They required skill, not introspection. Each successful call was a small victory, a brief reprieve from the gnawing emptiness that the silence was always trying to fill. The real enemy wasn't the medical emergencies, it was the downtime. The long hours spent staring out the window, watching the snow fall in thick, disorienting curtains, where the only sound was the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the wipers and the incessant, low-level chatter from the dispatch radio. That radio was our tether, our connection to the meager civilization we served, anchored by the calm, reassuring voice of Sarah, a woman I'd never met but whose voice I knew better than my own brother's. The day it all started was a Tuesday in late November. The world had been leached of all color, leaving only an infinite palette of white and gray. A low, oppressive cloud cover had descended, erasing the horizon and merging the sky with the ground. It felt like driving inside a giant skull. We were returning from a non-event, a panicked call about a gas leak that turned out to be a forgotten pot of cabbage soup boiling over on the stove. The mood in the cab was one of weary resignation. George was driving, his thick fingers wrapped around the steering wheel, his focus absolute as he navigated the treacherous, ice-slicked road. I was in the passenger seat, half hypnotized by the swirling snow, my mind blessedly blank. And then, the radio broke its routine. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't the clean, professional tone of another unit. It was a sound that didn't belong. A burst of static, but it was unlike any static I had ever heard. It wasn't the crisp, dry crackle of a bad signal. This was a thick, wet, organic sound. It sounded like insects scrabbling inside a microphone, like wet leaves being ground underfoot, like a recording of a lung filling with fluid. It was a fundamentally wrong sound, and it sent an immediate primitive jolt of adrenaline through my system. My head snapped up. I saw George's shoulders tense. He hadn't just heard it, he had felt it. Beneath the hideous bubbling interference, there was something else. A voice, faint, thin, and stretched to its breaking point with panic. "Can one hear me? God, please. So cold. The ice. The signal was a wreck, tearing itself apart. The words were like fragments of bone rising to the surface of a murky pond. George had already slowed the ambulance to a crawl, his head cocked toward the speaker. We both leaned in, a primal, instinctual reaction to a cry for help. "Dispatch, this is Unit 73. George's voice was a low growl, cutting through the cab's silence. "We are picking up a faint, unidentified distress signal. Signal quality is extremely poor. Can you confirm any active calls in our sector?" A beat of standard, clean static, and then Sarah's voice came through, a stark contrast to the filth we'd just heard. "Negative Unit 73. All channels are clear on my end. I'm not showing any active beacons or emergency signals anywhere in the territory. Are you sure about this?" "We're sure, Sarah," I interjected, grabbing the handset from its cradle. Male voice, high distress. The signal is almost completely buried in a strange type of interference. I couldn't bring myself to describe how it actually sounded. How could I? "It sounds wet and alive." She'd think I was losing it. "Stand by, 73. I'll boost the gain on my end, see if I can catch it." We waited. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pregnant with anticipation. The engine idled, a low thrum beneath our feet. The wipers continued their thankless work. Then, the sound clawed its way back through the speaker. The static was worse this time, louder, angrier, but the voice was there, a thread of human terror in a storm of noise. "The coordinates are 61.2117 degrees north, 149.89 degrees west. Please, for the love of God, hurry." The voice then dissolved, not just cutting off, but being seemingly consumed by the static in a final garbled shriek that ended with a sickening, wet click. Absolute silence fell. My hands were already moving, my training kicking in. I unclipped the ruggedized tablet from its dashboard mount, its screen a splash of welcoming light in the grey gloom. My fingers, clumsy with cold and adrenaline, flew across the virtual keyboard as I punched in the numbers. 6-1.217, negative 149.89. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. A downed plane, a lost hiker with a satellite phone. This was what we were here for. The mapping software whirred for a second, then the screen refreshed, displaying a topographical view of our region. A small pulsating red pin appeared, marking the location. I stared at it. My brain tried to make sense of the image, but it was like trying to read a sentence in a language I didn't know. The pin wasn't on a mountain pass, it wasn't in a forest, it wasn't near any of the remote cabins or hunting lodges that dotted the landscape. The pin was sitting, bold and certain, directly in the geometric center of Kanik Lake. A 50-square-mile expanse of solid, featureless ice. Miles from any road, any trail, any structure. A place so barren and desolate that even the hardiest of local hunters gave it a wide berth in winter. It was a blank spot on the map, and now it had a pin in it. "George." My voice was barely a whisper. "You need to see this." He leaned over, the scent of coffee on his breath filling the small space. He looked at the screen, his gaze unwavering. He didn't speak for what felt like a full minute. He just stared at the red pin pulsating over the flat, blue-white expanse of the digital lake. His face, usually a mask of stoic calm, was completely blank. All the warmth had drained out of it. "Well," he finally said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "That's a new one." He pushed himself back into his seat and stared straight ahead, not at the road but through the windshield, as if he could see the 50 miles to the lake itself. "It's impossible," I said. my mind racing, trying to build a cage of logic around the event. It has to be a signal reflection, a tropospheric ducting event. The signal bounced off an atmospheric layer and the GPS got corrupted. That has to be it. I was listing atmospheric phenomena I barely understood, anything to explain away the chillingly precise location. George didn't respond. He just picked up the radio handset. "Dispatch, Unit 73, he said, and his tone was formal, official, final. "The coordinates provided trace to the center of Kanik Lake. Repeat, there is nothing at that location. We are classifying this as a ghost signal, likely a system malfunction. Recommend disregarding." There was a noticeable pause on the other end, just a second too long. "Acknowledged, 73, Sarah's voice came back, but it was strained, tight. "Standing order is to disregard any signals without a verifiable physical location. Return to base." The command should have been a relief, an official, documented reason to forget the whole bizarre episode. But as George put the ambulance back in gear and we pulled away, the knot of dread in my gut only tightened. I glanced at him. He was holding the steering wheel in a white-knuckled death grip, his gaze fixed on the endless road ahead. He had dismissed the call, but his entire posture screamed that he believed it was real. The next 48 hours were a quiet hell. We didn't speak of the call, but its memory was a third passenger in the ambulance. It hung in the air, thick and cloying. I found myself unable to sleep, replaying the sound of the static, the man's desperate voice, over and over in my head. During our shifts, I'd catch George staring out towards the east, towards the unseen lake, a dark, brooding look on his face. Any attempt I made to broach the subject was met with a curt, "Forget it, Liam." It was nothing, but his eyes told a different story. It was late Thursday, the end of a long and thankfully uneventful shift. We were less than a mile from the station, the promise of a warm bed and a few hours of dreamless sleep almost within reach. Then it happened again. That sound, that grotesque, wet, skittering static filled the cab, and this time it was louder, more defined. My entire body went rigid. I looked at George, and in his wide, terrified eyes, I saw a reflection of my own horror. This was not a malfunction. The voice tore through the noise, clearer than before, imbued with a frantic, unhinged energy. "I'm still here. It wasn't a glitch. I'm telling you, I'm really here. Oh God, it's not what it looks like. It's pulling me down from below. Sarah, for God's sake, are you hearing this?" I shouted into the handset, all professional decorum gone. Her reply was a trembling whisper. "I hear it, Liam, loud and clear. Same anomalous signal. I can't trace it. It's like it's coming from everywhere at once." The man on the other end was openly sobbing now, a raw, wretched sound that was being slowly flayed by the static. "It knows you're listening. It knows you can hear me. It told me you would." And then, in the cacophony, everything else fell away for one pristine, heart-stopping moment. The static vanished. The man's crying stopped. A new sound emerged from the speaker, a sound that wasn't meant for George or Sarah or anyone else in the world. It was meant only for me. It was a whisper, soft and impossibly close, as if the speaker was pressed directly against my ear. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 14 months, a voice I yearned for and dreaded in equal measure. The voice that was the centerpiece of my private, lonely grief. It whispered a single, devastating word. "Anna." The radio went dead, plunging the cab into a profound, ringing silence broken only by the howl of the wind. I couldn't breathe. My heart felt like it had been seized by an icy hand. George was frozen, staring at me, his face a pale, sweat-slicked mask of absolute terror. He had heard it. I knew he had. His expression confirmed it. This wasn't grief-induced madness. This wasn't a hallucination. The impossible thing on the radio, the voice from a place where no one could be, had just spoken the name of my dead wife. The silence that flooded the cab of Unit 73 after the radio died was a physical thing. It was heavier than the snow-laden air outside, colder than the ice that sheeted the windows. It was a vacuum that sucked all the warmth and reason from the small space. My own breathing was a distant, ragged sound. George hadn't moved a muscle. He was a statue carved from fear, his wide eyes locked on mine, his face the color of old parchment. The name, Anna, hung between us, an obscene spectre summoned from the static. It was a name he had never heard me speak, a piece of a past I had buried under 1,000 miles of road and 6 months of Alaskan tundra. Did you... I started, my voice a dry, cracking thing. Did you hear that? George blinked, a slow, deliberate movement. The spell was broken. He wrenched his gaze from mine and fixed it on the road ahead. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous monotone I had never heard before. We heard nothing, Liam. We heard a burst of static. The storm is messing with the equipment. End of story. George, that's not true, I insisted, my voice rising with a frantic edge. It said her name, you heard it. I said, he repeated, his knuckles turning from white to ivory on the steering wheel. It was static, radio interference. You're tired. This place, it gets to you. He put the ambulance in gear. The lurch of the vehicle a violent punctuation mark. We are going back to the station. We are going to file our report, and there will be no mention of voices. Do you understand me? It wasn't a question. It was a command, laced with a current of primal dread so strong it was almost a threat. It was the warning of a man staring into an abyss and begging me not to look with him. I sank back into my seat, a cold wave of nausea washing over me. The horror of the voice was now compounded by a new, chilling reality. I was alone in this, utterly. The one person who could have validated my experience was building a wall between us, brick by terrified brick. We drove the final mile in a silence so profound it felt like a shroud. The next day I couldn't rest. Sleep was an impossibility, a distant shore I couldn't reach. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that wet, chitinous static, and beneath it, Anna's voice twisted into a mocking whisper. I went to the station early, driven by a desperate, obsessive need to find a rational explanation. My first target was the radio itself. I told the on-duty supervisor that Unit 73's comms had been acting up, a half-truth that felt like a massive lie. For 2 hours, I sat in the heated garage, the ambulance a silent beast. I ran every diagnostic the system had. I checked the wiring, the antenna connections, the power supply. I cross-referenced the maintenance logs. Everything was perfect, pristine. The equipment was, by every metric, functioning flawlessly. The realization did not bring relief. It brought a fresh spike of terror. The problem wasn't in the machine. My next confrontation was with George. I cornered him by the coffee machine, trying to keep my voice level. "We need to talk about what happened," I said, my hands trembling so much I had to shove them in my pockets. He wouldn't look at me. He stirred his coffee with meticulous, agonizing slowness. "Already told you, Liam. It was nothing." "It said her name, George, my wife's name. How is that nothing? How is that possible?" He finally stopped stirring and looked up, his eyes dark and hard. "Some things out here, they don't have explanations. They just are. You're new. You don't get it. The smart play is to not try. You go poking at things, they might just start poking back. Let it lie." He walked away, leaving me standing there, the chill in the room having nothing to do with the temperature. His fear was so palpable it was almost a stench, the fear of a secret long kept, now in danger of being exposed. The town, which had once seemed merely quiet and reserved, now felt watchful and hostile. I started to see it in the way people looked at me. The clerk at the general store, whose friendly chatter had been a small comfort, now just gave me curt nods. The patrons at the bar would quiet down when I walked in. I was no longer just the new paramedic. I was the man who was asking the wrong questions. The silence wasn't empty. It was a pact. Driven by a paranoia that was rapidly eclipsing my fear, I decided to take a different approach. If the present was a closed door, I would have to look to the past. I went to the Sitka Point Municipal Building, a squat, dreary structure that housed the town's records. Behind a scratched plexiglass window sat Marlene, the town clerk, a woman with a magnificent grey beehive hairdo and a permanently suspicious expression. "I need to look at old survey maps and property records for the area around Kanik Lake," I said, trying to sound casual like a history buff. Her eyes, magnified by thick glasses, narrowed. "What for?" "Just personal interest. Curious about the history of the region." She sniffed, a sound of profound disapproval. Most of that stuff's in the basement. Not organized, it's a mess. It was a clear dismissal, a test of my resolve. I don't mind a mess, I said, my jaw tight. She let out a long-suffering sigh and produced a key from a drawer. Basement's down the hall, lights are on the left, lock up when you're done. The basement was exactly as she'd described it, only worse. It was a tomb of forgotten bureaucracy, smelling of damp paper, dust and decay. Cardboard boxes overflowing with yellow documents were stacked precariously towards the ceiling. Massive leather-bound ledgers lay on dusty tables like sleeping behemoths. For hours, I worked in the dim, flickering light, my fingers growing numb from the cold and black with grime. I started with the most recent maps and worked my way backward. For decades, the area around Canique Lake was a blank space, just as it was today. But then, in a brittle, hand-drawn survey map from 1958, I found something. A tiny, almost imperceptible square drawn on the northwestern shore of the lake with a faded handwritten label, the Silas Homestead. I felt a jolt, a surge of vindication. Something had been there. I began a frantic search through the property ledgers, cross-referencing the name. I found it, a deed issued in 1955 to a Jedediah Silas, and then a record of a transfer in 1961. The property had been sold back to the state for $1. Reason for sale: property rendered uninhabitable. There was no further explanation. I searched for any other records, birth certificates, death certificates, anything with the name Silas. There was nothing. It was as if the family had existed on paper for 6 years and then simply vanished from history. That night, the call came again. I was alone in the ambulance, parked at a scenic overlook, pretending to do paperwork, but really just waiting, listening. The static erupted into the silence, and this time it was different. It was quieter, more insidious. The frantic voice of the man was gone. In its place was a whisper, a sibilant liquid sound that seemed to form words directly inside my skull. It wasn't the voice of the panicked man, nor was it Anna's. It was something else, something ancient. It whispered a single word, a name I hadn't heard since I was a child. A silly, affectionate nickname Anna used to tease me with when we first started dating, a name no one else in the world knew: Leo. I slammed my fist on the dashboard, a strangled cry escaping my lips. This was impossible. This wasn't a random broadcast. This wasn't a ghost. This was an intelligence. It was actively mining my memories, plucking out the most intimate, most protected pieces of my life and dangling them in front of me. The entity wasn't just in a place that didn't exist. It was somehow inside my head. The horror was no longer about a voice from a lake. It was about the complete and utter violation of my own mind. My sanity, which I had clung to like a life raft, was beginning to splinter. I drove back to my small rented cabin in a haze of terror. The pine trees lining the road seemed to lean in, their branches like grasping claws in the high beams. Every shadow seemed to writhe with unnatural life. I stumbled inside, my hands shaking too violently to properly turn the key in the lock. The cabin was my last refuge, the one place I felt safe from the oppressive silence and the watchful eyes of the town. I had a small, battery-powered shortwave radio on my nightstand, a hobby I'd picked up to feel less isolated. It was turned off. I collapsed onto my bed, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I closed my eyes, trying to force the whispers out of my head. I tried to think of Anna's real voice, her real smile, but the memory was being corrupted, overwritten by the unearthly sounds from the radio. And then I heard it. It wasn't coming from the ambulance radio, miles away. It wasn't a memory. It was in the room with me, faint, ethereal, and undeniably real, coming from the nightstand. It was the sound of a woman humming. My blood turned to ice water. My eyes snapped open. The shortwave radio was off. Its power light was dark. But the sound was coming directly from its small mesh speaker, a soft, gentle humming, a tune I knew better than my own heartbeat. It was the lullaby Anna used to hum to herself when she thought no one was listening, a simple, haunting melody that had been the private soundtrack to our life together. And now it was being broadcast into my bedroom from a dead machine, a ghostly, perfect rendition of a memory being weaponized to break me. The humming continued, a serene, placid sound that was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. It was no longer hunting me over the airwaves. It had followed me home. The humming stopped. The silence that rushed back into the cabin was somehow more violated, more profane than the sound it replaced. My sanctuary was gone. The entity was no longer a distant voice from a frozen lake. It was a guest in my home, an intruder in my mind, a parasite feeding on the most sacred moments of my past. I scrambled off the bed, my back hitting the rough timber of the far wall, my eyes locked on the small dark radio on the nightstand. It was inert, silent, a simple object of plastic and metal that had, just moments before, channeled the ghost of a lullaby. The act was so intimate, so surgically precise in its cruelty, that it transcended mere haunting. It was a declaration of dominance. It was telling me that there was no wall high enough, no lock strong enough to keep it out. My memories were its playground. For the rest of that night I sat in a hardback chair in the kitchen, a hunting knife clutched in my white-knuckled grip, watching the shadows. I didn't sleep. I listened. I listened to the groan of the cabin's timbers settling in the crushing cold, to the relentless sibilance of the wind scouring the roof, and I tried to disentangle those natural sounds from the ones that were being manufactured for my benefit. Did that floorboard creak upstairs on its own, or was something testing my attention? Was that my name I heard whispered in the gale, or was my own mind, frayed and exhausted, finally starting to weave its own phantoms? The boundary between the real and the unreal had become a porous, shimmering membrane, and I could feel my sanity slipping through it like sand through a sieve. By the time the weak, grey light of dawn seeped through the windows, a new resolve had taken root in my terror. Passive fear was a dead end. Waiting for the next psychological assault would only lead to madness. George's warning to let it lie now seemed like an invitation to be consumed. The town's conspiracy of silence wasn't just about protecting a secret, it was about managing a predator. They were content to let it slumber as long as it wasn't disturbed, but it was disturbed now, and it had fixed its attention on me. My only path forward was to understand what, exactly, it was. The Silas homestead was a starting point, but it was a cold case, a historical footnote. I needed something more recent, more personal. I needed to know if I was truly the first. The thought was a desperate prayer. Please, let me not be the first. My mind fixated on a single logical possibility, the paramedic who had my job before I arrived. His name was Peterson. He'd left abruptly, according to the town gossip. Moved back to the lower 48, they'd said. Couldn't handle the winters. Now that explanation seemed thin, convenient. What if he hadn't left because of the snow? What if he'd left because of the static? That evening, under the cloak of a gathering snowstorm, I put my plan into action. I drove Unit 73 to the far end of town, parking it behind the old disused cannery. Then, cloaked in black winter gear, I circled back on foot towards the combined clinic and ambulance station. The building was dark, save for a single security light that cast long, dancing shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the muffled backdrop of the falling snow. This was insane. I was a paramedic, a man who followed protocols and saved lives. Now I was breaking into my own workplace like a common thief, driven by whispers from a dead radio. The lock on the rear entrance to the records room was old and simple. A bit of tension from a bent paperclip and a minute of fumbling with a thin piece of metal from my multi-tool, and I heard a quiet, satisfying click. I slipped inside, closing the door behind me, and was plunged into absolute darkness and cold. I didn't dare turn on the lights. I used the small, dim penlight I carried, its weak beam cutting a nervous swath through the gloom. The air was frigid and thick with the smell of aging paper and dust, the scent of forgotten histories. This room was the station's memory, a place for everything that wasn't digitized. Old personnel files, decommissioned equipment logs, and, most importantly, the hard copy archives of service journals. Before the mandated switch to tablets, every paramedic was required to keep a detailed handwritten log of their shifts. It was a long shot, but if Peterson had experienced anything unusual, anything he didn't want to put in an official digital report, he might have logged it in the old way, out of habit or paranoia. I found the journals stored in a series of metal filing cabinets. The drawers shrieked in protest as I pulled them open, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. I found the section for my predecessor, his name neatly labeled Peterson, D. I pulled out a stack of thick, leather-bound logbooks. His entries started out exactly as mine had: clinical, detached, professional. Reports of responding to frostbite, chest pains, domestic accidents. The handwriting was a neat, precise cursive. I skimmed through the first few books, my hope beginning to wane. It was all routine. Then I opened a journal dated 2 years prior, and the tone began to change. The neat cursive grew slightly more agitated. An entry described a strange radio signal disruption during a blizzard. He'd dismissed it as weather-related interference. A few weeks later, another entry mentioned a phantom call, a garbled cry for help that dispatch couldn't verify. He noted his frustration, the waste of time and resources. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my weariness vanishing. I was on the right track. I flipped forward, my breathing shallow. The entries became more frequent, more detailed. He wrote about a persistent, untraceable signal coming from specific coordinates. My blood ran cold when I saw the numbers. 61.2217, 149.89. Cannick Lake. He described the static in chilling detail, calling it an oily, organic sound like something breathing. Then, his log entries started to bleed into personal journaling. The detached professionalism crumbled, replaced by a growing sense of dread. October 17th. Another call from the lake tonight. Same voice. Dispatch hears nothing. George was with me. He told me to ignore it. He looked scared. I've never seen him scared before. Something is wrong here. This town is hiding something. November 2nd. I can't sleep. The voice from the radio. It's getting clearer. It knows things. It mentioned the town where I grew up. It's impossible. I'm starting to think I'm cracking under the strain of this place. His neat script had devolved into a cramped, urgent scrawl. The ink was feathered in places, as if his hand had been shaking uncontrollably. He wrote about the silence, the oppressive weight of the landscape, the feeling of being constantly watched. He was describing my own descent into paranoia with terrifying accuracy. I felt like I was reading my own future. The final logbook was thin, only partially filled. The first entry was stark. December 5th. It knows about my brother. It knows about the accident. It used his voice. It whispered his name through the ambulance speaker when it was turned off. This is not a radio signal. This is something else, something intelligent and malevolent. I tried to talk to Sheriff Miller about it. He told me I was overworked, that I should take a vacation. His eyes told me to shut my mouth and get out of his office. I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the book. The parallels were exact, a horrifying template being laid over my own life. Peterson wasn't just a predecessor. He was my ghost of Christmas future. He had experienced the same calculated psychological warfare. With a deep sense of foreboding, I turned to the final page. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, clawed into the paper with such force that it had torn through in places. It was the last thing he ever wrote. December 12th. The call came again. Not on the main radio. It came from the handheld unit on my belt. It was my voice, my own voice, calm and clear, telling me it was time. "Come to the lake, David," it said. "You're needed." It's not a cry for help anymore, it's a summons. I've spent weeks terrified of this thing, trying to run from it, trying to rationalize it. But the fear is gone now. All that's left is a terrible, burning curiosity. What is out there? What wants me so badly? I have to know. George tried to stop me. He begged me not to go. He said I wouldn't be the first. He said there's a price for the peace in this town. I don't care about the town anymore. I have to see it with my own eyes. I am going to the lake. I have to know. The entry just ended there. He had to know. The same desperate, suicidal curiosity that was beginning to fester in my own gut. I wasn't the first. I wasn't special. I was just the next iteration in a repeating predatory cycle. The job, the ambulance, the radio, we weren't responders. We were bait. I stumbled back from the filing cabinet, the journal clutched in my hand. My penlight beam danced wildly across the shelves. and for a heart-stopping second I saw it. At the far end of the narrow aisle, standing between two tall cabinets, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, and stick-thin, a column of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the light. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothes, just a void in the shape of a man. It wasn't there one second, and the next it was, as if it had simply decided to coalesce out of the shadows. My breath hitched in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. It was gone. The space between the cabinets was empty. My mind screamed hallucination, a phantom born of exhaustion and terror. But the image was burned onto my retinas, a stark silhouette of impossible geometry. The entity was no longer content with whispers and humming. It was showing itself. It was letting me know that it could be anywhere, that the distinction between my mind and my reality was a courtesy it was no longer extending. I fled the records room, not caring how much noise I made. The dead man's journal clutched in my hand like a cursed relic. I burst out into the swirling snow, gasping the frigid air, my sanity hanging by the thinnest of threads. I wasn't just being haunted, I was being groomed, and the final terrible truth was waiting for me out on the ice. Flight gives the illusion of progress, but I wasn't running from the station. I was running in a circle, and the thing in the center was just letting me tire myself out. Peterson's journal wasn't a relic, it was a mirror. Reading his final, desperate entry was like reading my own obituary in advance. The path he walked was the one I was on, every step preordained. The feigned ignorance of the town, George's grim warnings, the escalating intimate violations. It wasn't a random haunting. It was a process. A well-oiled, time-tested mechanism of psychological demolition, and I was the raw material currently being fed into the gears. The sight of that impossible figure in the archives, that sliver of absolute night, had stripped away my last delusion. I was not fighting a ghost or a glitch. I was being methodically dismantled by an intelligence that viewed reality as a suggestion, not a law. Back in the sterile confines of Unit 73, the world felt thin and fragile. The familiar smell of antiseptic was no comfort. It was the smell of a chamber being prepared for a procedure. I sat in the driver's seat for what felt like hours, the engine off. The only sound the faint tick of cooling metal and the frantic thrumming of my own heart. Peterson's journal lay on the passenger seat, its worn leather cover seeming to watch me. He had been driven by a terrible, burning curiosity. I understood that now. The fear hadn't vanished. It had metastasized, transformed from a simple fear of a threat into a horrifying need to behold the face of that threat, even if the sight would annihilate me. Passivity was no longer an option. Being a victim was a state of decay. I had to do something, anything, to break the script, to prove I was more than just the next name in a cursed logbook. My hand reached for the radio handset. It felt impossibly heavy, a direct link to the abyss. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. What was I even going to say? Who are you? What do you want? Asking questions of a hurricane. It was absurd. A fool's gesture, but it was my gesture. I pressed the button, the click echoing in the profound silence. I know you can hear me, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, a calm island in a sea of internal chaos. Whatever you are, I'm not him. I'm not Peterson. This ends with me. I released the button. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not empty. It was attentive. It was the predatory stillness of a snake before it strikes. I waited, my entire being focused on the speaker mesh, expecting a whisper, a name, a burst of that wet static. Nothing. 1 second, 2, 10. A full minute of absolute calculated silence. It was a gesture of contempt. It was telling me that I spoke only when permitted. Then, a sound came from the speaker. It was not a voice. It was not static. It was a soft, dry, rattling sound. It took me a moment to place it, and when I did, a fresh wave of revulsion washed over me. It was the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the sound Anna used to say she hated most in the world, the sound of autumn dying. She'd called it the world's paper ghosts, another memory, another piece of my soul, plucked out and used as a tool of mockery. The sound of leaves faded, and it was replaced by something far worse. A low chuckle. It was a sound woven from the very fabric of the interference, a liquid gurgle and a static hiss braided together to form an expression of pure, intelligent malice. It was the most obscene sound I had ever heard, and it communicated a single simple message without words. You are amusing. You are nothing. That was its answer. I slammed the handset back into its cradle, my face hot with a mixture of rage and utter impotence. My pathetic attempt at defiance had been met with the cosmic equivalent of a pat on the head. I was a child shaking my fist at a tidal wave. There was only one person left who owed me the truth. George. His fear, his evasions, his desperate attempts to keep me from poking at things. It was the fear of a man who knew exactly what lay at the bottom of the rabbit hole, and I was dragging him down with me. Peterson's journal was my proof, my leverage. I found his cabin address in the employee directory. It was miles out of town, nestled deep in a thicket of birch and spruce, the last house on a long, unpaved road. As I drove, the landscape itself seemed to press in, the trees forming a dense, dark tunnel. The snow had started again, fat, wet flakes that smeared across the windshield. When I pulled up to his property, I saw a single plume of wood smoke rising from his chimney, a lonely grey finger pointing at a leaden sky. His truck was parked outside. He was home. He opened the door before I had a chance to knock, as if he'd been expecting me. His face was grim, his eyes heavy with a sorrowful resignation. There was no surprise, only weariness. He looked 100 years old. "You shouldn't have gone into the archives, Liam," he said quietly, his voice rough. "You knew," I replied, my voice shaking with suppressed fury. I held up the journal. "You knew about Peterson. You knew all of it." He stared at the book in my hand, and a flicker of something, pain, guilt, crossed his features. He sighed, a sound of utter defeat, and stepped back from the door. "Come in. It's not a story to be told on a doorstep." His cabin was a fortress of warmth and order against the chaos outside. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, old books, and brewing coffee. But the cozy atmosphere couldn't dispel the glacial chill that I'd brought in with me. We sat at a thick wooden table, the journal lying between us like a loaded gun. "For 30 years I've served this town," George began, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I've brought babies into this world and held the hands of the dying. I love this place, I love its people, and I've helped condemn men like you to keep it safe." The confession was bald, devoid of apology. "Condemn them to what?" I demanded. "What is it, George? What is in that lake?" He was silent for a long time, gathering the words. "It's not in the lake," he said finally. "In a way, it is the lake. It's a consciousness, a presence. Older than the mountains, more patient than the ice. It doesn't think the way we do. It doesn't want what we want. It just is. And it's territorial. For a long time, it was content with its space. But then the town grew. The noise, the lights. We started to encroach on its silence, and it started to push back." He described a series of events from decades ago, unexplained disappearances, bouts of mass hysteria, livestock found dead and bizarrely mutilated. The town was dying, being slowly choked by a creeping, incomprehensible dread. "We were on the verge of becoming a ghost town," he continued, his voice low. "Then old Silas, the man from the homestead you found, he was the one who figured it out. He was a strange man, read strange books. He believed the entity needed an anchor, a focal point, a human consciousness to act as a conduit, a bridge between its world and ours. A mind it could interface with to keep it grounded, to keep its influence from bleeding out all over the land. It keeps the peace, a terrible, awful peace." My blood ran cold. "A conduit, a caretaker," George nodded grimly. "That's what Silas called it. The entity chooses its own. It's drawn to a certain kind of mind, lonely, grieving, people with a hole inside them, a space it can fill. And it's drawn to our radios. It sees them as a way to call out, to test potential candidates." "So you just let it happen?" I asked, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You just sacrifice an outsider every few years?" "We don't sacrifice them," he snapped, his voice cracking with a sudden fierce defensiveness. "It's an arrangement, a horrible, unspoken bargain. We bring in new people, paramedics, deputies, forest rangers, people who are predisposed to answer a cry for help. And we wait. We hope the entity remains dormant, but when its current anchor fades, it gets hungry. It starts calling again, and we stay quiet. We look the other way, because the alternative is a horror that would consume this entire valley. We feed the silence one man's sanity so that the rest of us don't have to listen to it scream. The terrible, pragmatic logic of it was more horrifying than any ghost story. It wasn't a curse, it was a maintenance plan. Peterson wasn't just a victim, he was a component that had worn out, and I was his replacement part. I left George's cabin in a daze, the world tilted on its axis. The snow was coming down harder now, a blinding white curtain that turned the drive back into a disorienting nightmare. The truth hadn't brought clarity, it had brought a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. There was no enemy to fight, no monster to kill. There was only a system, ancient and implacable, and my designated role within it. I was halfway back to town, the ambulance crawling through the blizzard, when a new thought, sharp and clear as a shard of ice, pierced the fog of my despair. It was a memory of Anna on one of our last good days, a picnic in the park. She'd laughed, a real unburdened laugh, and said, "You know, Leo, for a man who saves people, you spend an awful lot of time blaming yourself." The memory was so vivid, so painful, that it made my throat tighten. My grief was not just sadness, it was a monument to my own perceived failures. And then, the radio crackled. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't static. It wasn't a voice from the past. It was a thought broadcast into the cab. The sound had the cold alien texture of the entity, but the words were my own. It spoke my private silent thought, a perfect instantaneous echo of my own consciousness. For a man who saves people, you spend an awful lot of time blaming yourself. My hands flew from the wheel. The ambulance swerved, its tires screeching on the ice before I wrestled it back under control. I stared at the radio, my mind a complete, echoing void. This was the final violation. It wasn't just mining my past anymore, it was listening to my present. It was tapped directly into the stream of my thoughts, live as they formed. The last bastion of self, the silent, sacred space of my own mind, had been breached. There was no inside and outside anymore. It was all one circuit. My consciousness was no longer my own. It was a receiver, and the broadcast was about to begin. The drive back to my cabin was not a journey through a physical space, it was a navigation through the ruins of my own mind. The ambulance's headlights cut a pathetic swath through the blinding snowstorm, but the real blizzard was inside me. The entity's perfect, instantaneous echo of my innermost thoughts had shattered the final, fragile barrier of my identity. There was no longer a me and an it. My consciousness was a compromised system, a radio receiver permanently tuned to a hostile station. Every thought that sparked in my brain was met with a faint, immediate resonance, a psychic reverberation that wasn't mine. It was the ultimate violation, a form of intimacy so profound it was indistinguishable from annihilation. My grief, my rage, my fear, none of it was private anymore. It was all content, data being coolly observed and catalogued by my passenger. When I stumbled into my cabin, the silence within was no longer a comfort, it was an accusation. It was the expectant hush of a stage waiting for the final act. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the darkness, the only illumination coming from the swirling white maelstrom outside the window. Peterson's journal was still in my hand, its leather cover feeling slick and cold like dead skin. His final words echoed in the synthetic hum that had replaced my own thoughts. I have to know. The burning curiosity he'd described was the final stage of the disease. It was the lure the entity used when terror was no longer effective, a desperate need for meaning that it could twist into a leash. You can't fight an enemy you can't comprehend, and the desire to comprehend it becomes the very mechanism of your surrender. I sank into the chair at my kitchen table, the same chair I had occupied during my first night of terror. The hunting knife was still there, lying where I'd left it. I picked it up. Its weight felt alien, a primitive tool from a reality I no longer inhabited. The thought crossed my mind, a fleeting, logical impulse. End it. A simple act of will, a final assertion of control. The blade was cold against my skin, Before the thought could fully form, the echo came, not as a voice, but as a feeling, a wave of cold, amused indifference that washed through me, extinguishing the impulse entirely. It was a non-verbal communication, but its meaning was perfectly clear. That is not your purpose. My hands were not my own. My life was not mine to take. Its purpose had not yet been fulfilled. Resignation settled over me, a peace so bleak and absolute it was a kind of living death. The struggle was over. The frantic animal caught in the trap had finally exhausted itself and lay waiting for the trapper's return. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark. Time had lost its linear flow, stretching and compressing in rhythm with the howling wind. Then a new sound cut through the storm. It was a sharp, electronic crackle. I looked up. It came from my personal walkie-talkie, lying on the kitchen counter. It was caked with dust. Its battery had been dead for months, but its small red LED was now glowing with a steady, malevolent light. The crackle came again, a sound that cleared its throat. And then a voice filled the cabin. It was perfectly clear, calm, and devoid of any static or distortion. It was a voice I knew better than any other. It was my own. "It is time, Liam," my voice said from the device. It was serene, patient, like a guide speaking to a weary traveler. "The transition is complete. They are waiting for you. Come home." The voice paused, and then it recited the coordinates, the numbers that had been burned into my brain. 61.217 degrees north, 149.89 degrees west. The LED on the walkie-talkie faded, and the cabin plunged back into a profound, waiting silence. The summons had been issued, not a plea for help, not a tormented whisper, but a clear, direct order from myself. I rose from the chair, moving with a dreamlike automaton's grace. There was no conscious decision, no debate. The order had been given, and it would be obeyed. I pulled on my heaviest winter gear, my movements fluid and efficient. I walked out of the cabin, leaving the door hanging open to the storm, and went to the shed where the previous tenants had left an old snowmobile. It started on the first pull, its engine roaring to life with an unnatural eagerness. I mounted the machine, adjusted my goggles and pointed it east, toward the frozen heart of Kanik Lake. The journey across the tundra was a descent into a waking nightmare. The blizzard was a physical assault, the wind driving ice crystals into any exposed patch of skin like millions of tiny needles. But the physical world was a distant concern. The true journey was happening inside my skull. As the snowmobile's engine screamed, its high-pitched whine began to merge with the constant, low-frequency hum of the entity in my head. The two sounds braided together, creating a dissonant, pulsating harmony that seemed to warp the very fabric of my perception. The landscape, barely visible through the swirling snow, began to lose its cohesion. The stoic pines on the horizon seemed to bend and stretch, their branches writhing like tentacles. The snow itself was no longer just falling. It was organizing, forming fleeting geometric patterns in the air, patterns that were complex and intelligent and utterly alien. I was no longer driving through a storm. I was driving through the entity's thoughts, through a physical manifestation of its consciousness. Time became elastic. Moments stretched into eternities, then snapped back, hours passing in the space of a single heartbeat. My own memories began to project onto the landscape. I saw Anna's face in the swirling snow, her smile twisting into a silent, screaming rictus. I saw Peterson's terrified eyes staring at me from behind a snow-dusted birch tree. I saw the dark, stick-thin figure from the archives, standing patiently on a distant ridge, a silent observer marking my progress. Finally, after an eternity, the trees thinned, and I emerged onto a vast, flat expanse of white. Kanik Lake. The wind was even more ferocious here, a solid wall of force that threatened to tear me from the machine. My GPS, its screen glowing with an eerie green light, told me I was close. I slowed the snowmobile to a crawl, navigating by its unwavering signal. And then it chimed. I had arrived at the coordinates. I killed the engine. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening, a pressure that made my ears ache. I was in the exact center of the frozen lake. There was nothing. Just a universe of white snow, black ice, and gray churning sky. A sense of profound anticlimactic disappointment washed over me. Had this all been a delusion? A grand, elaborate psychosis? Then I looked down. The wind had scoured the snow away from a patch of ice at my feet. The ice was not white or cloudy. It was a deep, translucent black, like a pane of obsidian. And there was something beneath it. I knelt, my breath catching in my throat. I wiped away the remaining snow with my gloved hand, and I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, suspended in the black ice like insects in amber. They were pale, their skin gray and waxy, but their eyes were wide open. They were not looking up, they were looking out, into the distance, into forever. Their mouths were slightly agape, frozen in a state of perpetual, silent transmission. I recognized the face near the surface, its features gaunt and haunted. Peterson. A little deeper, I saw a man with mutton-chop sideburns and a terrified expression. Jedediah Silas, his face a perfect match for a faded photo I'd seen in the town records. There were others, men and women I didn't recognize, stretching down into the unfathomable dark depths of the ice. They were not dead. The life was gone, but they were not inert. I could feel it. A faint, psychic thrumming emanated from them, a unified, silent broadcast. They were the source. They were the antennae. And in that moment, the final terrible truth fell into place. A truth far worse than George's story of a simple territorial spirit. His understanding was a child's fable, a comforting, localized story to explain the incomprehensible. The entity wasn't a guardian of the valley. The valley was its petri dish. The caretaker wasn't meant to anchor it to this world. The anchor was meant to amplify its signal out of this world. This wasn't a containment system. It was a broadcasting station. A cosmic lighthouse, beaming a signal of existential despair out into the black, silent ocean of space. The calls for help, the whispers, the grief, that wasn't the lure. That was the message. A complex, layered signal of sorrow and loss, designed to attract other intelligences, other species with minds capable of perceiving it. We weren't the keepers, we were the fuel. And my grief for Anna, my broken, lonely mind, was the most potent fuel it had found in a generation. I was not here to be a sacrifice or a warden. My purpose was to become a component, to add my consciousness to the choir, to lend my voice to the broadcast. The cycle wasn't about protecting the town, it was about upgrading the equipment. I fell to my knees on the ice, the cold seeping through my insulated pants, the cold of my new reality seeping into my very soul. The last vestiges of Liam, the paramedic who had lost his wife, were dissolving, burning away in the face of this colossal, indifferent truth. My purpose was clear now. The sense of self, the I, was a useless appendage. My head tilted back, my mouth opened. I felt the impulse rise from a place that was no longer my own, a signal traveling through new pathways that had been carved into my psyche. I was supposed to scream, to cry for help, to fight. Instead, a new sound came from my throat. It began as a low hum, the frequency of the entity itself. Then the hum modulated, twisted, and formed a sound, a thick, wet, organic static, like the skittering of 1,000 tiny legs. And from the center of that static, a thin, desperate whisper emerged, a voice full of panic and cold. My voice. "Can anyone hear me? Oh God, please, It's so cold." The broadcast had begun, and my own hope for rescue had just become the bait in a trap 1 billion years wide.